Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel, and Mirtz Hashem today we will be learning Daf Kuf Pei Amud Beis. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We pick up today on the very bottom line of Kuf Pei Amud Aleph, in the middle of Siman Shin Lamed Vav Sif Beis. We're continuing to learn the halachas of Mishtamish Be'ilon, using trees, leaning on things that grow from the ground, etc., etc. Our learning today should be a schus for Achenu Kabeis Yisrael, Hanusunu Batzar B'Shivya, Imde Be'Bayom Be'Bain Be'Abasha, Hamakim Yerachem Aleihem V'Yitzim Yitzar L'Rvacha Me'Afel L'Oira Mishiba L'Geula, Hashta B'Gol V'Zman Kariv V'Nemar Amen. Our learning should be a schus Refuah Shalema for Yitzchak Ben Sion Ben Dusha, Esther Fradl Bas Chana, Rivka Shira Bas Leah, Chavadasa Bas Serel, and Yeshua Levi Ben Ahuva Malka Chana. They should all have a Refuah Shalema B'Sar Shar Chayla Yisrael. So, in the beginning of Sif Beis, here, near the bottom of Kuf Pei Amud Aleph, the Mechaber discussed the question of tree roots. So, we learned the halacha, you're not allowed to be mishtamish be'ilan. There's an issa d'Rabbanan. Chazal were afraid that if we allow somebody to make use of a tree on Shabbos, he may actually go up into the tree and come to pull something off the tree, whether break off a branch or pick off some leaves or flower blossoms or maybe even a fruit, and come up against the Issa Daraisa of Toilesh. So to guard against that, Chazal made a gzera that you're not allowed to be mishtamish be'ilan on Shabbos. You're not allowed to make use of a tree on Shabbos. In Sif Beis, the Mechaber discussed the question of tree roots. The Mechaber introduced us to the concept that anything that's lower than 3 tfachim to the ground, if you have something growing from the ground, but it is not 3 tfachim tall off the ground, then it is nechshav kekarka. It's considered like the ground itself, and therefore you're allowed to make use of it. Making use of it does not fall under the issur of being mishtamish be'ilan. So what happens when you have tree roots? Tree roots, very often, they protrude up from the ground, but probably most often, they are less than 3 tfachim off the ground. 3 tfachim is approximately 12 inches, a foot. Most tree roots, I would think, are lower than a foot off the ground, and therefore you would be allowed to be mishtamish with the tree roots. You want to sit down and rest for a minute on some tree roots, you would be allowed to. You want to step on some tree roots in order to gain some height for some reason, you would be allowed to, because that's not considered being mishtamish be'ilan. If you have a very tall tree root, you do have trees where the roots start breaking out very high from the ground. If you have high tree roots and they're more than 12 inches off the ground, more than 3 tvachim, then that would be asur, because that would be considered being mishtamish be'ilan. Now, the Mechaber discusses a case, very common, where you have tree roots. Tree roots are not, they're not manufactured. They're not man-made. So they're not very straight and linear. You have tree roots that are bumpy. They slope up. They slope down. So says the Mechaber in the bottom line, at the middle of the line, Kuf Pei Amud Aleph, V'imboim milamala. Let's say you have tree roots that start at a height of more than 3 tvachim off the ground. V'yardim lamata. And then as the tree roots spread out further away from the tree, they slope downwards. And eventually, they are less than 3 tvachim off the ground. Well, then says the Mechaber, b'makayim shegavayim shloisha, on the part of the tree root that is elevated more than 3 tvachim off the ground, asurim, you're not allowed to make use of that part of the tree root. Uv'makayim she'ein gavayim shloisha, but where the tree root slopes down, and it is less than 3 tvachim elevated off the ground, mutarim, over there it would be mutter to make use of the tree root. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Chaf, back on Kuf Pei Amud Aleph. V'imboim, if the tree root continues out from the tree and it slopes downwards, v'imboim dala'achar shehugbu shloisha, in such a manner so that further out from where it was elevated 3 tvachim, chazru v'nichbefu, it now bends and it slopes downwards back to the ground, well, then it's going to be mutter to make use of the part that is lower than 3 tvachim. And I find this Mishnah Berurah to be very, very interesting. Ois Katan Chaf Aleph. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Afal Gav, even though, Mishnah Berurah seems to say, think about this for a second. It's very interesting. Let's pause here for a second. When you have a tree, and the tree has roots, right? over time, the same way the tree is growing upwards, right? And the tree gets taller every year, the tree roots are growing outwards. And the tree roots extend further and further and further from the tree over time. So now let's visualize this for a second. You have a tree, and it has nice high roots close to the trunk of the tree. So let's imagine that the tree roots close to the trunk of the tree are more than 3 tefachim elevated off the ground. All right, so you're not allowed to use those part of the roots. Now, over the years, the tree roots grow. Now, when the tree roots grow, I'm not sure exactly how to think about this, but in a sense, it could be that the part of the tree root that was higher than 3 tefachim off the ground grows, and it continues extending out, and eventually it becomes less than 3 tefachim off the ground. So in a sense, if we're saying that you're allowed to be mishtamish with the part of the tree root that is elevated more than, you're not allowed to be mishtamish with the part of the tree root that's elevated above 3 tefachim. But then as the root grows and extends over the years further and further, it reaches a point where it's less, and now you're allowed to be mishtamish with a part of the tree root that's less than 3 tefachim elevated off the ground. In a sense, what we're saying is something that was usher, because when it was up over here it was usher, is now mutter, because it grew further, and now it came down here, and over here it's mutter. I think that's the gist of what the Mishnah Berurah is saying over here. The Mishnah Berurah says, still in all, it's not a problem. Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah's words. He says, even though this part of the tree root that is bent and is going down, it grew from a part of the tree root which is aser. It's growing from a part of the tree root that was elevated more than 3 tefachim above the ground, and over there it was aser. When it was over there, when it was elevated above 3 tefachim, you weren't allowed to use it. Still in all, when the root grows, the nichpaf lamata, and it bends downwards, and it comes within 3 tefachim of the ground, hutter b'makam hanamuch, it becomes mutter to use it at the low place. Why? The kekarka chashivi, because once it reaches within 3 tefachim of the ground, now it is considered like karka, and therefore using it is not called being mishtamish be'ilan. So again, the way I'm understanding it, and I'm not a botanist, and I'll tell you in my mind what I'm puzzling over. When tree roots grow, how do they grow? So what I'm asking is, let's say this is the tree, right? This is the tree trunk. And you have roots growing off of the tree trunk. So when the tree is very young, you have roots that extend only a little bit. And then over the years, the roots continue growing out. How do they grow? Is it that the piece that was over here, it grows, and now 5 years later, if you would make a mark on the tree root over here, 5 years later, would that mark be over here? Because it grows out from the tree? Or if you made a mark on the tree root over here, it would remain here, and it's growing off at the end. I don't know for sure which way it is, but what the Mishnah Berurah seems to be suggesting, what the Mishnah Berurah the Chavetz Chaim seems to be seeing as a chiddush, is that you're telling me that if once upon a time you had a section of the tree root that was over here, and it was higher than 3 tefachim off the ground, so that it was usher. But then over the years it grows out to where eventually it becomes lower down, and now it's within 3 tefachim of the ground, it becomes mutter. The Chavetz Chaim is seeing that as a chiddush, because at one point this was usher when it was up here, and now that it's down here, it's becoming mutter. That's the way I understand the words of the Chavetz Chaim over here. He's seeing this as a chiddush. Ulafizeh. And according to this, continues the Chavetz Chaim, according to this understanding, kolshkein, so now we see as a kal v'chomer, shemuter lehistamish be'ikroi shel ilan, that you're allowed to use the trunk of the tree, bepachas b'shloisha tvachim la'aretz, when at a point where it is within 3 tvachim of the ground. Afal pisha ilon gavaya ba'oid. Even though the tree might be 100 feet tall, but you're allowed to use the part of the tree trunk that is within 3 tvachim of the ground. Shaharei makom zal loy nesar me'olam. The tree grows up, obviously. It doesn't grow down. So if you want to make use of the part of the tree trunk that is within 3 tvachim of the ground, you're not making use of a part of the tree that ever was usher. This part of the tree was never usher. Anything that was under 3 tvachim was never usher. Now, if it continues to grow up, maybe it will become usher. But we don't have a case with the trunk of the tree where it was usher and then it became mutter. By the roots, the Chavetz Chaim is suggesting, it seems that we could have a case where once upon a time it was usher, when the root was above 3 tvachim, and then it grew down and it becomes mutter. And that the Chavetz Chaim is seeing as a chiddush. Now we have the next case over here in the Mechaber. A little bit difficult to understand, but I'm actually going to show you Art Scroll's diagram from the Art Scroll Shas in order to understand it. Says the Mechaber, and this is coming from a Brisa in Masechtas Eruvin Daf Kuf Amud Aleph. Hayu gevayim shloisha. Let's say you have a root of the tree that is 3 tvachim elevated above the ground. So it's a tall root. But the reason this root, when we measure this root, the reason we're getting a height of Gimel Tvachim is because the cholol tachteim, the ground level, the ground is not even. So you have a section of the root where the ground level, there's like a ditch in the ground, and the root is filling up that ditch. But when you measure from the bottom of the ditch to the top of the root, you get more than 3 tvachim. So how you gevayim shloisha, you're measuring over there a section of the root, and it is more than 3 tvachim elevated from the ground, because you have to measure from ground level under the root. And this root is like growing kind of inside a ditch. That's v'cholol tachteim. There's an empty area. There's like a ditch underneath it. Afal pi shemitzad echad ein cholol tachteim. Now, there's a ditch, and the root is filling up the ditch, but then the ground level comes back up again. And the root, right, so you have like this. You have the tree is over here. This is your tree. Over here, there's a ditch. The root grew into the ditch. Now, you measure from the bottom of the ditch to the top of the root, it's more than 3 tvachim. So the root over here is more than 3 tvachim off the ground level. You're not allowed to be mishtamish with it. But the ground level comes back up, so that when the root comes out over here, it is at ground level. Now, what's the halacha? Are you over here, this part of the root that's more than 3 tvachim off the bottom of the ditch, that you certainly can't use. It's more than gimel tvachim off the ground. It's not considered like the karka. But then when the root extends out and the ground comes back up, over here the root is within 3 tvachim. Now, we just said in the beginning of Siv Beis that when you have roots that go up and down, and part of the root is higher than 3 tvachim, and part of the root is lower than 3 tvachim, we said you're allowed to make use of the part that's lower than 3 tvachim. You're not allowed to make use of the part that's higher than 3 tvachim. Is this the same case over here? Says the Mechaber, no. How you gvayim shloisha v'chol tachteim. If the root grew down into a ditch, and now that whole part of the root is more than 3 tvachim elevated off the ground, afal pisha mitzad echad ein cholol tachteim v'harei hein shavim la'aretz, even though at one side of the root the ground level comes back up, and over there it is equal to the ground level, aser leishev afilu al tzad hashav la'aretz. In this case, you're not allowed to sit even on the part that is equal, that is at ground level. Now again, I said I was going to show you the diagram because I think that they actually made quite a good diagram, and I think that this is a good time for some visual example. Let's see if I can pull it up here quickly. Okay. Oh, come on. Why did it close? Pardon me, it'll take me just a second to find it. I prepared it. Oh, here it is. Okay. If you take a look at that diagram, I think that could show you very well what I was saying. You see how the root comes out from the tree kind of into a ditch. So when you measure from the bottom of the ditch to the top of the root when it's close to the tree, you have 3 tvachim. That part you're certainly not allowed to use because you're using a tree root that is more than 3 tvachim elevated off the ground. But you see how the root grows kind of into the bank or where the ditch, where the ground level comes back up. The question is, how about over there? Over there, it's not elevated more than 3 tvachim off the ground. Over here, the halacha says the mechaber is, you're not even allowed to use that end of the root that is at ground level. Now, let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Chaf Beis. Chaf Beis, yeah. Hayu Gevayim. So, simply reading the mechaber, it sounds very much like we're continuing to talk about tree roots. And indeed, I think that's how most people are going to learn this Mishnah Berurah, even though the Mishnah Berurah is going to use the word anofim. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ritzayna Loimar, what is this case that the mechaber is depicting? Sha'anofim yoitzim mitzidai shelo ilon lemata. You have branches or roots. I think, like the Art Scroll did, Art Scroll wasn't being mefarish to Mishnah Berurah, he's being mefarish to Brisa in the Gemara in Eruvin, that the mechaber is coming off of. I think that the Chavetz Chaim may also mean roots over here, and he's calling them anofim simply because they come from a higher point on the tree, klape, when you take it into consideration the ditch. Or the same halacha really could be true, I guess, with branches. You have this tree branch or root extending from the tree at the base of the tree, but from there down to the ground level you have 3 tvachim, because like the mechaber said, because it's in a ditch. Even though on one side of this root, the ground level comes back up higher at that side of the root, so that you don't have from the ground level to the top of the root 3 tvachim. So like we saw in that picture, when close to the base of the tree, there's a ditch. So when you measure from the bottom of the ditch to the top of the tree root, you do have 3 tvachim. But then the ground level came back up and the root's kind of growing into that embankment, so that at the end of the root, it's at ground level. It's certainly less than 3 tvachim. And over there, the mechaber said you're not allowed to use even the side that is at ground level. Says the Mishnah Berurah, v'dafka mitzad echad. This is only true when it's only at one side that the root hits ground level. The bottle oisoi tzad legabe ashloisha tzadim shesham nirin goiva shloisha tvachim. Let me see if I could quickly pull up the diagram again. I don't know if the app, I'm using the Art Scroll app on an iPad over here, and it could, oh no, it stayed open. Imagine, if you will, that when you're looking at this, you're looking at the front of the tree. Now let's imagine that if you went around the back of the tree, you would see the same exact thing. You'd see the other side of the root. And it's only when you come kind of over to this side, over here, if you look at the tree from here to this side, you'll see that the root is at ground level. But from every other elevation that you look at the root, from all other 3 elevations, you see that the root is in the ditch, and the root is elevated more than Gimel Tvachim off the base of the ditch. That's what the Mishnah Berurah says. That's when the mechaber is saying that you cannot make use of the tree root even at the side where it's at ground level. Why? Because it's bottle. What does that mean that it's bottle? It doesn't mean Yeridea Hilchas Bittel. I think what it means, you have to take into consideration the Chavetz Chaim's other words. He says, Shesham nirin goiva shloisha tvachim. When you look at this tree root, you see a tree root that's more than 3 tvachim elevated off the ground. Because when you look at it from every side, when you look at it from every elevation, you're going to see a tree root that's more than 3 tefachim off the ground, except on one side. On one side, you look at it, and over there it's ground level. That's not a tree root that we're going to call ground level, that's nechshav kekarka. That's a tree root that we consider to be gibel tvachim tall, and it falls under the rubric of ein mishtamishin be'ilan. Aval im mishneit stadin shavin la'aretz. But if on two sides it's at ground level, oisan at stadin mutarin l'ishtamish alein, then on those sides you would be able to make use of the tree. I do want to make mention, by the way, of one thing. I remember many years ago, the first time I said shir on these halachas, I was a little taken aback, because when I was young and I was growing up in Borough Park, and the shul that we davened in had a big yard next to it, and when we were 6, 7 years old, we used to play outside in the yard, and there was a tree stump. And we loved to sit on the tree stump. Everybody sat on the tree stump. It was a very convenient tree stump. So if we were playing a game and you were out, you could go sit on the tree stump. And that tree stump was definitely more than 3 tvachim off the ground. I learned these halachas, and I said, oh my goodness, so you mean all those years when we were playing in the yard and we were sitting on the tree stump, we were going against an Issa D'Rabbanan. We being over an Issa D'Rabbanan of being mishtamish be'ilan. Now, obviously, it was a dead tree stump. It was a dead tree that had been cut down. It was just a stump, right? But, high level, we learned at the beginning of the Siman, bein lach, bein yavesh. Even if it's totally dead tree, we said that you're still not allowed to be mishtamish be'ilan. But if you take a look at Yarech HaShulchan seems to say very, very clearly that if you have a dead tree that was cut down and you have a stump, and the stump is more than gimel tvachim off the ground, that is something that you are allowed to be mishtamish with. It has no shaykhs to the gzeiro sheba yalav yitloish, and that is something that you are allowed to do. I think he uses a lashon over there in Yarech HaShulchan, and he's saying this even though ein raya lozeh, even though he doesn't have a clear raya to it from anywhere, but that is his psak, and that's what he's saying. Okay. Now we go finally to Siv Gimel. Siv Gimel is, the name of the Siman was Im mutter leilech al gabe ha'asavim. Are you allowed to walk on grass and other types of vegetation? So here at Sif Gimel says the Mechaber, mutter leilech al gabe ha'asavim. You're allowed to walk on different types of grasses and vegetation. Bein lachim, whether they're fresh and moist. Bein yaveshim, or whether they're dry. Kevan she'enoi miskaven litloish. Since when you walk on the grass, you have absolutely no kavana to uproot the grass. So very clearly, the concern that the Mechaber was, the potential concern that the Mechaber was dealing with over here was the question of koitzer or toilish, right? You're going to walk on the grass, and we know that sometimes when you walk on grass, whether your shoes get stuck on the grass or you're walking and you're sliding your feet and you're kicking the grass, very often you end up uprooting grass or some other type of vegetation. Is this an issue? Says the Mechaber, no, it's not an issue. Why is it not an issue? Because it's a davar she'eino miskaven. Kein she'eino miskaven litloish. Because it's a davar she'eino miskaven. Your kavanah is to walk. Your kavanah is not to uproot grass. Obviously, we're going to have to say that it's not a psik reisha. It sounds like if it's a psik reisha, you would have a problem. Let's take a look here in the Mishnah Berurah. It says the Mishnah is Kadach Hafdalet, Bein Lachim. Umashba b'Gemara, the implication of the Gemara is Sha'afilu im ha'asavim heim aruchais. Even if people haven't cut the grass in a while, so that the grass and the other vegetation is quite tall. V'hu haylech yochef, and you're walking barefoot. Sha'asavim regilim liyos nidbakin bekishrei etzba'osav. And when you walk barefoot on tall grass, very often the grass gets between the toes, and then it could get uprooted. Afilu hachim mutter, it's still mutter to do this. The lav psik reisha hu sheyitalesh, because it's simply not a psik reisha. Can it happen? Yes, but it is not inevitable. And since it's not inevitable, it's not a psik reisha, it's a davar she'eino miskaven, it is mutter. V'lachein. And therefore says the Mishnah Berurah, afilu im yitalesh, even if you walk and you do end up uprooting grass, gam kein ein iser alav, there's no iser, shu eino mechaven lezeh, because it's a davar she'eino miskaven, it's not a psik reisha, there's no iser involved. Umikamakim, nevertheless, says the Mishnah Berurah, im la'achar halichasei matza shenidbeku asavim baragloi bein etzba'osav oy al min olav. Let's say you took a walk through the grass and when you come home, you see that there's grass on your shoes. Or you are walking barefoot, and you see that there's grass on your feet, and there's grass between your toes. Very interesting, says the Mishnah Berurah. Yizaher, you must take care, shalo yisal kem biyadav, that you don't remove the grass using your hands. Da'asurim betiltel mishum muktzah, because the grass is muktzah. Why is it muktzah? The ben hashmashos hayu mechubarim, because ben hashmashos, it was attached to the ground. Mechubar lekarka is muktzah. It's muktzah machmas gufay. So ben hashmashos, the grass was muktzah. Now it got uprooted. Kevin just got soy le ben hashmashos. It's got soy lekula yuma. Once it was muktzah during the ben hashmashos period, it remains muktzah for the entirety of Shabbos. Now you can't go pull those pieces of grass off your shoes with your hands because they are muktzah. I guess you would have to do it klachiyad. You'd have to do it tiltum and atzad. Wipe it off with something. It's tiltum and atzad shaloi l'tzarech davar aser. You're not doing it for the grass. Eis kan chafei came and mechavin. Ayin b'bir halacha shekasavnu. Take a look at the bir halacha di Ramaskal Mutter, where the Chavetz Chaim says we wrote teheicha da'asavim heim gedolim. When you're walking through very tall grasses, yizar shelo yarutz alein, you should take care not to run on them. To have a psik reisha sheyitalish bevadai, because then the Chavetz Chaim says it is a psik reisha that you're going to uproot vegetation. Ve'afshir dafilu leilech alein b'mehera gamkein tzarich lizar. Could be you should even be careful not to walk particularly fast. Okay, continues the Mechaber in Sif Gimel. 3 lines off the bottom of the beginning of the line. Aval. Ha'oichlim beginois. People who eat outside in a garden. Asurim lital yedeim al ha'asavim. Once we're discussing the question of walking on grass, so now the Mechaber brings up, okay, so you're allowed to eat outside in the backyard because you're allowed to walk on the grass, no problem. Now you want to wash the tilas yadayim. Are you allowed to wash the tilas yadayim on the grass? Says the Mechaber, no. Asurim lital yedeim al ha'asavim. Shamash k'maisam, because you're watering the grass. And watering the grass is a problem either of zayreya, planting, because you're helping the grass grow, or chayrish, because by watering the grass, you're getting the ground wet, and by getting the ground wet, you're softening the ground, and one of the purposes of plowing is to soften the ground. So when you water the ground, it could be a problem of chayrish. You're watering the grass, it could be a problem of zayreya. So if you're eating outside in the backyard, can you wash the tilas yadayim over the ground, over the grass? No, you cannot. It's a davar she'eina miskaven. You just want to wash the tilas yadayim. Says the Mechaber, so what? Psik reisha. It's a psik reisha. When you water plants, you help them grow. So, and when you water ground, you make it softer. It's a psik reisha, and therefore it doesn't help that it's a davar she'eina miskaven. But the Mechaber says, aval mutar lahatal behemei raglayim. Back in the day when you didn't have indoor plumbing and Beis HaKisei wasn't always readily available, if somebody had to use the facilities, you would be allowed to urinate on the grass, or to pour other types of liquids on the ground, she'enom matzmichin, that do not have the effect of helping growing things grow. Urine does not increase growth. It doesn't simulate growth. Because Adarabah, it's acidic and it's strong in Adarabah, it can have the effect of maybe hampering growth, maybe killing the vegetation. But it is not going to make anything grow, and therefore there would be no problem here of Zayreya. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Cotton Chafav. Shamashkim Oisan, you can't pour water of the tilas yadayim on the grass. V'hamashkes azroyim, when you water growing things, chayiv mishum zayreya. Is it a deraisa of zayreya, demoya latzmiach, because you're helping it grow. V'gam mishum chayrish, you also have a problem of chayrish. And in the Sharetziad Ois Kot Yud Ches, he points out here, Ulafizeh, Yesh Lizar Gam Bekarka She'en Zruah Im Rakamedes Lacharisha. You would have a problem even pouring the tilas yadayim water on ground that is not planted, that doesn't have vegetation, but he says that would only be if it's a medes lacharisha, if it's waiting to be plowed, not ground that you're not going to grow anything in, that nothing's growing on. So v'gam mishum chayrish shemarafia akarka yedei lichluach. Ois cotton chavzayim psik reishahu. Even though you're not mechaven to make anything grow, it's a psik reisha. The efshir shelo ye'il legadlam, because it's inevitable. that when you pour water on growing things, it helps them grow. If you're eating in a garden that doesn't belong to you, or not somebody who's a particular friend of yours, yesh matir, and then there are those that are mekel and they're matir to pour natil sidai water there to sphere lahu, because they hold kevad psikresha like nichalehu. Now it's a psikresha where you don't care. Yeah, it's true that by pouring water on the grass you can help it grow, but it's like klum. You don't care. It's not yours. It's not anybody that you care about. You have absolutely no interest in helping whatever's growing there grow. So in that case, there are those that are matir. Shariaf lechatchila aber v'harbe paiskim oisrin gam b'psikresha l'nichale lechatchila. We had many paiskim. We saw this earlier in Siman Shinchaf. Many paiskim hold that even by psikresha l'nichale, that's something that lechatchila is also. V'chamavur b'seif Siman Shinchaf sif yudches ayin sham. Meraglayim is not a problem. L'fisha azim heim, because they are strong and acidic. V'sarfim esazraim adarabah, they burn and they hamper the growth of growing things. Umoinim oisam milat smiach, so it would simply not be a zereya problem. This would also be true of other liquids like meraglayim that have a negative effect, and they certainly don't have a positive effect on the growth of the grasses. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the Hainu, Kegon yayin, for example, wine. Lefishu az the chazak, wine is strong and powerful. V'seirif gamken azraim, it also has the effect of burning growing things. V'chein shar mashkeshu kein zeh, or other beverages that are similar. V'kasav Magen Avram dalachatchila roy lizar af b'mashkim. The Magen Avram wants to be machmir and says you should be careful even with other types of mashkin. V'ayin bel yerav shekasav debayayin shu chazak in lizar klal v'chanal. Yel Yerabba writes that strong wine, certainly you don't have to be concerned. Kasav the Pri writes the mei dvash, honey mead, the sheichar, yesh ben mayim, beer, these things have water in them, ubavadim atzmichin, and therefore they do help growth. Okay, we're going to pause over here. We'll continue next time with the words of the Ramah. Thank you so much for joining me for Libin HaTorah. This list of Libin HaTorah should be Megan Agas Klal Yisrael, the Rosh Hashem should send Yeshua's, Refuas, Parnaset, Sheduchim to all those in need. We should be Zeicha to see the Biaskel Tzedek, B'mheriv Yameinu, Amen. Be well.